There are some stories that should never be told, some truths that should have stayed buried with those who took them to the grave. My name is Thomas, and for 18 years, I've prepared brides for their eternal weddings, 18 years restoring beauty to those who never made it to the altar in life. 18 years helping families fulfill the final wishes of their daughters, wives, sisters. But one bride never left the chapel. Those of you who follow me know I've never romanticized death. You know I've always told the stories exactly as they happened. No sugarcoating, no comforting lies. But this story challenges everything we think we know about death, about love, about what it truly means when we say, "Till death do us part." If you believe death is the end of all dreams, that the dead rest in peace once the coffin is closed, that love dies when the heart stops beating, maybe you should stop listening now. Because what I'm about to tell you will forever change the way you see the power of true love. This is the story of Sarah Elizabeth Morrison, the bride who refused to leave this world before getting married, the bride who proved that some wedding vows are stronger than death itself. And if you're wondering whether this really happened, if what I'm about to say is true, well, there are still white rose petals at St. Mary's Church that have never withered. There's still a wedding dress that appears and disappears from the altar. And there is still a love that crossed the boundary between life and death. Get ready to meet the bride who never left the chapel, and get ready to question everything you thought you knew about eternal love. It was October 2018. Autumn had arrived early that year, painting the leaves in shades of gold and red that seemed to hint at change in the air. The funeral home was preparing for what would become the most tragic service I had witnessed in nearly 2 decades of work. Sarah Elizabeth Morrison, 24 years old, had passed away 3 days before her wedding. 3 days, 72 hours, that separated a young woman from living out the dream of her life. A car accident on the eve of the rehearsal, on a road she had driven hundreds of times. She was still wearing her wedding dress when they found her. The police report said she left home at 2:30 p.m. for one last dress fitting. The wedding was set for Saturday at St. Mary's Church, the same church where her parents got married, where her grandmother had married. A family tradition Sarah was determined to honor. When the family came to the funeral home, Sarah's mother, Helen, was inconsolable. It was her dream since she was a little girl, she kept repeating through tears. She planned every detail of this wedding, every flower, every candle, every word of the vows. And then she made a request that changed everything. "We want her to be buried as a bride," Helen said. "She'll wear her grandmother's dress, the pearls I wore at my own wedding, the veil she embroidered herself. At least in heaven, she'll be the most beautiful bride." But Sarah had other plans. Plans I only discovered when it was already too late. When they brought Sarah's clothes, something immediately caught my attention. The wedding dress the family had chosen wasn't the same one she was wearing during the accident. It was older, with intricate details that looked like they came from decades past. French lace, hand-stitched pearl beading, a level of craftsmanship rarely seen these days. "This was her grandmother's dress," Helen explained. "Sarah had chosen it for the ceremony. She said she wanted to keep the family tradition, that every generation of Morrison women should wear this dress at the altar. But there was something about the dress that unsettled me, an energy, a presence I couldn't explain. I began the preparation as I always did, but from the first moment I could tell Sarah was different, not physically. She was beautiful, serene, with a peaceful expression that contrasted with the tragedy of her death. It was something more subtle, deeper. Her hair seemed to glow with a light of its own. Her hands, when I placed them over the bouquet, had a different temperature. Not cold, as they should have been, but an absence of cold that puzzled me. And then I started noticing the little details that truly disturbed me. Every time I adjusted her veil, it moved back on its own, always into the same position, partially covering her face, as if she were getting ready to walk down the aisle, as if she were preparing for someone who hadn't arrived yet. And then, on the second night of preparation, I began to hear the music, a wedding march, played very softly, as if from far away. I thought it might be a rehearsal at the nearby church, but whenever I checked, the place was empty. The music seemed to be coming from somewhere else, some other time. That's when I began to suspect that Sarah wasn't truly gone, not in the way we understand death. She was waiting for something or someone that hadn't come yet. On the third night of preparation, the signs became impossible to ignore. I had positioned Sarah with her hands gently clasped over the bouquet of white roses she had chosen for the wedding. But every time I returned to the room, her hands were in different positions. These weren't normal post-mortem shifts. They were deliberate, like she was adjusting the flowers, straightening her dress, preparing herself for something important. And the veil. The veil kept moving, as if an invisible breeze was blowing through the room. I decided to take a closer look at the dress. There was something about it that disturbed me beyond reason. As I examined the lace, I noticed small stains that didn't look like age or wear. They were tears that were still wet, impossible as that might sound. That's when I found the first clue. Hidden in the lining of the dress, between the layers of tulle and silk, was a small folded note. Written in Sarah's delicate handwriting, with blue ink I recognized from the wedding invitations her family had shown me. "If something happens to me before the wedding," the note read, "please take me to St. Mary's Church. I want to marry David, even if it's after death. Promise me I won't leave this world without becoming his wife. True love doesn't end with death." My first instinct was to call David, the groom. He was devastated, as expected, but when I mentioned the letter, he fell silent for a long moment. Then he told me something that chilled me to the bone. Sarah had been having a recurring dream in the weeks before the accident, he said. She saw a woman in a wedding dress at St. Mary's Church waiting at the altar. The woman always said the same thing: no bride leaves the chapel without getting married first. David told me Sarah had researched the church's history. She discovered that in 1952, a bride named Elizabeth Morrison, her own grandmother, had died the morning of her wedding. A heart attack caused by anxiety. She never made it to the altar, never said the vows she had practiced so many times. Sarah believed her grandmother was still there, waiting to be married, David continued. She said she could feel her presence during the rehearsals and sometimes saw a figure in white walking through the church aisles. That's when I began to understand. The dress wasn't just a family tradition, it was a connection, a bridge between two generations of Morrison women who had been kept from the altar. Sarah wasn't just dead, she was fulfilling a promise made decades ago. That night, as I finished the preparation, something happened that confirmed all my suspicions. Sarah opened her eyes. It wasn't a reflex. She truly opened her eyes and looked straight at me. "Where's David?" she asked, her voice soft but clear. "He should be here. I can't go without marrying him first." And then she closed her eyes again, as if nothing had happened. That night, I knew I could no longer ignore what was happening. Sarah wasn't dead, not in the way we understand death. She was trapped between two worlds, held by an unfulfilled promise, by a love that refused to accept the end. And I knew that if I didn't do something, Sarah Morrison would never find peace. She would remain forever, the bride who never left the chapel. The next morning, I decided to dig deeper into the Morrison family history. I went through the church archives and spoke with Father Smith, who had known the family for decades. What I discovered completely changed my understanding of what was happening. Elizabeth Morrison, Sarah's grandmother, had died on October 15, 1952, exactly 66 years before Sarah's death. Same day, same month. But there was more. Elizabeth had also died 3 days before her wedding. She was also 24 years old. She was also supposed to wear the very same wedding dress. Father Smith told me Elizabeth had been found dead in her room, dressed in her wedding gown, holding a bouquet of white roses. The doctors claimed it was a heart attack brought on by wedding anxiety, but the family always suspected something more. Elizabeth was obsessed with the idea that something would stop her wedding, the priest explained. She had been having nightmares for weeks, dreaming that some invisible force was keeping her from reaching the altar. On the day she died, she told her mother that no matter what happened, she would marry her fiancé, even if it was after death. That's when I began to see the pattern. This wasn't a coincidence, it was a family curse, an unfulfilled promise passed down through generations, waiting for someone brave enough to break it. I called David again. This time I was direct. "David, you need to come here tonight. Sarah is waiting for you." He thought I was crazy, but something in my voice convinced him. He said he'd come. While waiting for David to arrive, I kept researching. I discovered that other Morrison women had died under similar circumstances. Mary Morrison in 1923, Catherine Morrison in 1889, all young, all on the verge of getting married, all dead 3 days before the ceremony. And all of them had reportedly been seen at St. Mary's Church after death, figures in white dresses walking the aisles, waiting at the altar. The church had developed a dark reputation in town. Many people avoided getting married there, especially after sunset. When David arrived, he was pale, shaken. "I felt her in the car," he told me. Sarah was in the passenger seat wearing her wedding dress. She asked me not to give up on her, not to let death separate us. I led David into the room where Sarah lay. When he saw her, his legs nearly gave out. "She's more beautiful than ever," he whispered. "She looks like she's just sleeping, waiting for me to wake her up so we can go to the church." That's when the bells of St. Mary's began to ring, but it wasn't Sunday and no ceremony was scheduled. The bells were playing the wedding march, the same music Sarah had chosen for their wedding. David looked at me with an expression I'll never forget. "She's calling me," he said. "Sarah is calling me to the church. She wants to marry me tonight." In that moment, I understood it wasn't just Sarah who was trapped. The entire Morrison lineage had been waiting for this moment, waiting for someone brave enough to break the cycle, to finally let a Morrison bride walk down the aisle. "Let's go to the church," I said. "Let's finish what started nearly a century ago." David nodded, and together we carried Sarah to the car. She felt lighter, almost ethereal, as if she was eager to finally reach her destination. As we drove towards St. Mary's Church, I could feel the presence of other women in the car. Elizabeth, Mary, Catherine, all the Morrison brides who had never made it to the altar, all waiting for this moment of redemption. When we arrived, the church doors were open, the candles were lit, and at the altar I could see figures in white dresses waiting. The Morrison family had finally come together. When we entered St. Mary's Church, the air was filled with an energy I had never felt before. It wasn't dark or threatening, it was expectant, full of hope, as if decades of waiting were finally coming to an end. The altar candles were all lit, casting a golden glow that danced across the church walls. David carried Sarah in his arms, and I could swear I saw a smile forming on her lips. She was radiant, more beautiful than any bride I had ever prepared. As we walked down the central aisle, I saw other figures materializing in the pews. Women in wedding dresses from different eras, all from the Morrison family. Elizabeth sat in the front row, smiling with tears in her eyes. Mary and Catherine were just behind her, holding bouquets that glowed with their own light. Father Smith had arrived before us. He later told me he'd felt an irresistible pull to come to the church, as if someone had been whispering his name. When he saw us enter, he didn't seem surprised. It was as though he'd been waiting for this moment all his life. We placed Sarah at the altar. David stood beside her, holding her hand. And then something magical happened. Sarah opened her eyes. Not just that, she stood up, tall and glowing in her wedding gown. "You came," she said to David, her voice clear and full of love. "I knew you would. I knew you wouldn't let death keep us apart." David was crying, but smiling at the same time. "I promised I'd marry you," he said, "a promise that counts in this life and the next." Father Smith began the ceremony. His voice echoed through the church, as if amplified by invisible choirs. "Dearly beloved, we are gathered here in the presence of God and this special congregation to unite David and Sarah in holy matrimony." When it came time for the vows, Sarah spoke in a voice that seemed to come from beyond. "David, I've loved you since the moment I first saw you. Not even death can dim that love. I promise to be your wife in this life and the next, until time itself ceases to exist." David replied, tears streaming down his face. "Sarah, you are my soulmate. I would wait 1,000 lifetimes for you. I promise to love you forever, even when my body can no longer stand beside yours." When the priest said, "You may kiss the bride," it was pure magic. David kissed Sarah with such love, such devotion, I could feel the energy shift in the church. It was as if a weight that had lingered for decades was finally lifted. Sarah smiled, the most radiant smile I've ever seen. "Thank you," she said, looking at me, then at the other Morrison brides. "Thank you for giving us the chance to finish what we started." And then she began to dissolve. It wasn't frightening. It was beautiful. Sarah turned into thousands of white rose petals that danced through the air like snow. The petals shimmered with their own light, creating a spectacle straight out of a dream. The other Morrison brides also began to dissolve. One by one, they transformed into light, into petals, into pure, loving energy that filled the entire church. Decades of waiting, decades of unfulfilled dreams, finally at peace. When it was over, David stood alone at the altar, holding a bouquet of white roses that would never wilt. Father Smith held a marriage certificate signed by an invisible hand. And I had witnessed the greatest act of love I've ever seen. Sarah Elizabeth Morrison had finally been married, and with her, the entire line of Morrison brides found the peace they had sought for generations. Love had conquered death, and the promise had at last been fulfilled. We left the church in silence. David held the bouquet of white roses Sarah had left behind, and I carried the marriage certificate that proved the impossible had happened. Father Smith walked us to the car, but before we parted ways, he handed me something. It was an old time-worn photo. It showed Elizabeth Morrison in her wedding dress, standing at the altar of St. Mary's Church. But she wasn't alone. In the background, almost invisible, were other female figures in white dresses. The photo was dated 1952, but it had been taken on the night Sarah got married. "Some things transcend our understanding," the priest said. "Some promises are stronger than death. You witnessed something very few mortals ever do. True love knows no limits, not even the boundary between life and death." David went home that night, not as a man who had lost his bride, but as one who had fulfilled the most important promise of his life. He told me he could still feel Sarah by his side, that he sometimes heard her laugh, and that in his dreams they danced together as husband and wife. 3 months later, David met a woman named Lisa. He told me it was Sarah who introduced them, that in a dream she told him he deserved to be happy, that she would always be with him, but that he deserved to have love in this life too. They got married at St. Mary's Church, and during the ceremony, several guests reported seeing a figure in a white dress smiling in the front row. St. Mary's Church changed after that night. It stopped being a place haunted by sorrow and became a place of hope. Couples from all over began seeking it out for their weddings, saying they could feel a special energy of love and protection in the air. I never prepared a bride the same way again. Now, whenever I care for a young woman who passed before her wedding day, I ask the family about her dreams, her plans, her love, because I learned that death is not the end of everything. Some promises are eternal. The white roses Sarah left on the altar have never wilted. They're still there, always fresh, always fragrant. Father Smith says they're a reminder that true love is immortal, that some blessings go beyond human understanding. David still visits the church every Sunday. He sits in the same pew where Sarah waited for him for decades. He told me he sometimes still smells her perfume in the air, sometimes catches a glimpse of her reflection in the stained glass windows when sunlight filters through. And I keep Sarah and David's marriage certificate in a special place at the funeral home, not as some morbid curiosity, but as a reminder that my work goes beyond preparing bodies for final farewells. Sometimes I help souls find peace, to fulfill promises that death interrupted. Sarah Elizabeth Morrison taught me that true love knows no limits, that some promises are too sacred to be broken by death, that sometimes our job is to help the dead live out their final dreams. If you've made it this far, if you're still with me after this confession, leave the word eternal in the comments, because some loves, some dreams, some wedding vows truly are eternal, and maybe you have your own love story that transcended death. Remember, Death is not the end of everything. Some promises are stronger than the grave. Some brides never leave the chapel until their vows are fulfilled. And some love stories are truly eternal. Until the next confession. And may your love be strong enough to transcend any barrier, even death,